Andrew Brown Cunningham was born into a family with decidedly high levels of achievement. His father, Daniel John Cunningham, had acquired a list of letters after his name that was only one character shorter than his actual full name, being a skilled medical doctor and biologist. He would have 3 sons and 2 daughters, of which Andrew would be the second son. His older brother would follow in his father's footsteps and become a successful and noted doctor in the Indian Medical Service. His younger brother would become a successful general in the army. Oddly enough, Admiral John Cunningham, who would succeed him in his most famous posting, was actually no relation. In his own words, a Scot, though born in Ireland, coming into the world on January the 7th, 1883, he recalled a happy childhood growing up in and around Dublin, albeit rarely seeing his father, who was either working, travelling for work, or otherwise engaged. At best, they might enjoy half an hour or so with him of an evening when they weren't on holiday or at weekends. As a result, a governess and other staff were hired to help with the raising of the family, and young Andrew appears to have gotten on fairly well with them. In 1891 there was something of a change when he was sent to a school in Dublin, which he disliked and apparently learnt very little at. About a year later, therefore, he was sent to Edinburgh, where he lived with his aunts on his mother's side whilst attending the Edinburgh Academy. Starting off with some difficulty, he made rapid progress and within the year had been advanced to the senior school element of the establishment, which meant that he was considered at least a couple of years ahead of his age academically. With an established interest in the sea, he was still somewhat surprised when his father sent him a message suggesting that he might like to join the Navy. This nonetheless appealed to him and his aunts, and so, declaring that he would like to become an admiral, he agreed. This, however, meant another relocation, which was pretty much to the other end of the country, fetching up at Mr. Foster's school, Stubbington House, Fareham, just northwest of Portsmouth and sitting at the end of the network of small inlets that lead off the northern end of Portsmouth Harbour. The school specialised in preparing young boys for naval service and would be his home for almost 3 years. Later in life, Cunningham would recall, "We were well looked after and very well fed. Old Montague Foster was a great character." Even writing after World War II, he noted that he still recalled much of what he learnt there. He hated foreign languages, and English for that matter, but found a gift for mathematical work. He also found himself deeply uninterested in most sports and would go on to describe himself as lazy, but he also followed the path of enlightened laziness, wherein the best way to have as much time to oneself as possible was to identify the quickest and most efficient method of doing a job right the first time, and carrying that through, as it meant you then didn't have to go back and fix things later on. At the close of 1896, his class went to London to take the Civil Service Naval Examination. He came top of his class and 14th out of the 65 of the larger pool of candidates that was then accepted into naval service. This enabled him to join the training ship HMS Britannia on January the 15th, 1897, aged just 14. To his delight, he found most of the academic work that mattered was in some way, shape or form dependent on mathematics, with practical work taught on the tender Wave and week-long cruises at sea being held to learn practical seamanship aboard the screw sloop Racer. Again, leaving aside sports for the most part, he instead spent much spare time applying himself to seamanship, or when the weather was bad, to chess. One sport, if you can call it that he did find himself part of, however, was an unofficial boxing league, or more accurately, a fight club, wherein he acquired his nickname for his time as a cadet of Meatface, which some of his classmates, including one James Somerville, would later remind him of. The summer of 1897 was a particularly memorable one, as they were loaded aboard a trio of geriatric old ships and sailed down to Spithead to take part in the Diamond Jubilee Naval Review, where he got a glimpse of Queen Victoria. He also got to meet Admiral Henry James Raby, who, as a much younger man, had received the Victoria Cross for actions in the Crimean War, and being one of the first such recipients, he was the very first officer to actually be awarded the medal by Queen Victoria herself. His sailor's toughness had then been put to the test when the Queen reportedly accidentally pinned the medal not only through his uniform, but through his chest. Fortunately, he apparently didn't show any outward sign of discomfort while on parade. The commander of Britannia at the time was one Christopher Craddock, who would of course later go down with his ship at the Battle of Coronel. Cunningham left Britannia in spring 1898 as 10th in his class, having to pass tests in 15 different subjects ranging from religious knowledge to navigation and technical drawing, as well as French and English. His 3 certificates consisted of a second class in French and extra subjects, having scored 510 marks out of 750, with first-class certificates in mathematics and seamanship, having scored 1,171 out of 1,500 and 616 out of 700, respectively. He'd also learned to swim, and had not been detected in any of the slightly underhand escapades that he may or may not have gotten up to. With 7 months of sea time acquired in his time on Britannia, he would only need 1 month at sea on active service before he was eligible to become a midshipman, which duly occurred on June 15, 1898. Although wanting to go to sea, he actually had no particular preference for where when he was initially asked, so when his friend Henry Archer Colt, a man who would fight in all 3 branches of the armed services over the next 2 world wars, said that he rather liked the idea of the Cape and West Africa station, a small squadron with an exotic area to patrol, he decided to put his name down for that as well. Shortly thereafter, although there were no guarantees, both were actually assigned to the cruiser HMS Fox, which was on the Cape Station, with passage booked there via RMS Norman, along with a range of other naval personnel, which included the new station commanding officer, and a variety of civilians, some of which he described as most peculiar, one of which was Cecil Rhodes, with whom he ended up having dinner after having gotten lost and being unable to find his assigned table, and he would later encounter Rhodes, besting him in the final of the ship's chess tournament as they headed down the West African coast, although Cunningham does attribute this perhaps to Rhodes having had a liquid lunch before the final. Arriving at Cape Town, they found the Fox was somewhere up the east coast and not expected back for some time, and so they were brought instead aboard the station flagship, HMS Doris. Unfortunately, the ship was overcrowded and had, at best, indifferent food, and it was thus a relief when the smaller but less cramped Fox arrived and took the 2 boys off for their thoroughly enjoyable year based at Zanzibar. At this stage, the dining wouldn't be too unfamiliar to a man from Nelson's Navy. In the heat of the African coast, fresh food lasted 2 or 3 days from the time after they left port, refrigeration having not made it onto most Royal Navy ships at this point, after which it was down to salt pork or salt beef with ship's biscuit. Cunningham was assigned the position of assistant to the ship's navigator, who turned out to be an excellent tutor. As a result of his skills, the young midshipman was granted command of one of the ship's sailing cutters when it was in port. Bar river-bound gunboats and a pair of slightly larger bark-rigged cousins, Fox was the only ship on this aspect of the station, and so he experienced visiting most of the East African coast within the year. Without wireless, which had yet to be invented, the voyages were also more akin to the age of sail. Occasional telegrams from Cape Town would be picked up on periodic returns to Zanzibar, but outside of this, the ship could essentially go where it wanted to and do what it liked, within reason. This would all come to an end in May 1899 as the Fox was recalled home after 3 years on station, and Cunningham found himself back aboard the Doris. Once again subject to poor food and overcrowding, the Second Boer War kicking off in October provided a possible way out. A naval brigade was being assembled by Captain Percy Scott, who'd arrived aboard the massive cruiser Terrible, soon joined by her equally massive sister Powerful. Scott was a gunnery expert, and the first contingent of the brigade went off whilst he and some of the crew experimented with how to construct field mountings for the ship's 12-pounder guns, before then turning their attention to the possibility of dismounting some of the ship's larger weapons as well, and taking them overland to help out at the siege of Ladysmith, where the army's smaller and shorter barrel weapons were being comprehensively outranged by the latest Krupp guns that had been supplied to the Boers. Scott duly dispatched a detachment of his best gunners with a number of 4.7-inch guns that he'd extracted from his ship, under strict orders to introduce the Boers to what real long-range gunnery was like, something that the gunnery crew would do quite successfully. A second naval brigade was also dispatched, which did something to relieve the overcrowding situation aboard the Doris. Then a new major of the Marines arrived to replace Doris's former major, who'd been killed in action with the 2nd Naval Brigade. Cunningham asked if he could come along to the front. The new major agreed, along as the captain was also in agreement, and so the young midshipman went straight to the captain's cabin and was soon on his way ashore with written permission. By 5 p.m. of the same day, he was on a train to the front line. Making it into the field in March 1900, he met Lord Roberts at Bloemfontein. Lord Roberts was a family friend, but much to his disappointment, Cunningham was left behind as the main force advanced on Pretoria, as he'd been assigned to one of the two 12-pounder guns that were also left behind to defend the place. But within a week, he was recalled to the front line by Lord Roberts himself, which unfortunately did nothing to endear him to some of the more senior naval officers in this detachment of the Naval Brigade, who felt that their authority had been circumvented. Nonetheless, train, cart, and a few helpful soldiers caught him up to the Naval Brigade's guns the evening before the battle for Pretoria started. Under fire from Boer snipers and their Krupp field guns, Cunningham distinguished himself first in serving a 4.7-inch gun, and then helping to bring up an ammunition wagon whilst under heavy shell fire. This renewed barrage silenced the Boer artillery, and then, annoyed by continued sniper fire, the 4.7-inch battery sent a flurry of precision-aimed high-explosive shells in their direction as well, which silenced the snipers rather comprehensively. Later examination found that the shells had hit a wall, turning it into hot stone shrapnel that hadn't done anything good for the health of the snipers, who'd been basing themselves in a half-height trench behind it. This was followed by engagements around Diamond Hill, where he collected some of the remains of the shells fired in his direction, and discovered that his unit was blessed to have one Lieutenant Colquhoun, who seemed to be the greatest forager in all of southern Africa, thus keeping them all in fresh food, in no small part thanks to an Australian unit's predilection of driving flocks of sheep through the naval camp for a bit of a laugh, usually at very early hours of the morning, whilst on their way to the commissariat department. Colquhoun, I think that's how you pronounce his name, it's a very odd spelling, tended to have the last laugh, however, as 2 or 3 of the sheep would usually go missing during the drive through the camp, and mysteriously turn up in that evening's dinner as a result. After another action, a trip back to the coast to meet his father, who'd been assigned to oversee medical care in the campaign, and another trip back to the front lines, Cunningham would have his first meeting with Walter Cowan, at this point Lord Kitchener's naval aide-de-camp, but more on that later. However, upon arrival at the Great Crocodile River, they found the war mostly over, and so in September 1900, aged 17, the Naval Brigade was recalled to their ships. Finding their train's locomotive was hopelessly clogged up and worn out, it was fortunate that the Naval Brigade included a contingent of stokers, and the old engine was soon hauling them south rapidly, which, apart from one minor incident where they crashed into another train that was coming north, quickly got them back to the Doris. Upon arrival, Cunningham was disgusted to find out that the bulk of the souvenirs and other things that he'd sent back from the front line, including 20 solid gold Krugerrands, had been stolen by his erstwhile shipmates, and so he opted to return home, albeit after a rather interesting encounter with the port's cashier, as he went to collect his back pay, which between time on the East Coast and over 7 months in the field, which had an additional field service allowance, it meant that he was sent on his way with a bag of 100 gold sovereigns. He later reflected that the campaign ashore had taught him responsibility and self-reliance, and the value of rapid improvisation, all things which would service him very well in the future. After a few weeks' leave, he and a number of his crewmates from Fox were reassigned to the Hannibal, a battleship in the Channel Fleet, from which he would observe Queen Victoria's funeral procession as she was moved from the Isle of Wight back to the UK mainland, before the ship set out for a spell in Gibraltar, where he gained further seamanship experience as he was by now in charge of a 56-foot picket boat, and Hannibal was moored outside the mole, which meant he had to convey people back and forth, often in the full force of the weather that's experienced in the Straits of Gibraltar. He also maintained his habit of low-level undetected misdemeanours upon discovery that one of the scuttles in his assigned area of the ship opened up onto the platform of the port ladder, by which method it was possible, if one was slim enough, to effect entrance and exit from the ship at night without unduly disturbing the officer of the watch who was at the top of said ladder. Returning to Portsmouth in July 1901 saw a brief stint aboard the Martin, a brig that was used as a training ship. This enjoyable period lasted until October of the same year, when Cunningham was assigned to the cruiser Diadem, where he undertook considerable study, as with his 19th birthday approaching, he was due to take his lieutenant's exam. He was annoyed that not only did the exam require 3.5 years of service, but also had a minimum age of 19. With his reaching the required service time 3 weeks before he reached the minimum age, he lost a number of places on the seniority list while he waited for time to catch up with his capabilities, and this rankled him somewhat. Nonetheless, January the 7th, 1902, saw him pass with a first-class certificate and a rapid dispatch to the Royal Naval College in Greenwich for the next stage of his studies. These consisted of navigation and piloting, which were taught at Greenwich, and gunnery and torpedo lessons, which were taught at Portsmouth. He found himself playing catch-up, as many of his classmates had studied pretty much their entire service careers for this stage, whereas his stint in South Africa had left him somewhat behind. Whilst he managed to just about make it into the advanced course, his inherent laziness, by his own admission, meant that only a series of second-class certificates were acquired this time in everything except torpedo warfare, which he did particularly well at. Further disappointment was to come when he found that all of the officers from Doris who'd served in the South African campaign would be noted for early promotion. All except him. The perceived slight mentioned earlier had resulted in the relevant officers specifically excluding him, despite his having been in action longer than anybody else from that ship. Nonetheless, he would eventually get his lieutenant's commission, which would be signed amongst others by one Admiral Fisher. But, in the interim, he was sent to the battleship Implacable in the Mediterranean, taking passage aboard HMS Renown, which was at the time Fisher's command, transferring to the Vindictive at Gibraltar for onward passage to Malta, where his actual assignment lay. It was not, however, a happy ship, and after 6 months, when a vacancy opened up on the destroyer Locust, he was quick to apply for it, and in September 1903 he was on his way there, the start of a long and enjoyable stint in this kind of ship. Although at this stage still a sub-lieutenant, the ship's captain himself was only a lieutenant, which meant that Cunningham had gone from being one of many low-level officers to second in command of a commissioned warship overnight, albeit the ship was only one of 300 tons. This, however, proved enjoyable in the extreme, and he helped the ship undertake a successful exercise in which the Mediterranean fleet's destroyers infiltrated a harbour to launch torpedoes at the fleet's battleships, a surprise attack which had a real-life counterpart the next year when the Japanese attacked the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur. His time in Locust was brief, as after 4 months she was paid off and he transferred to the Orwell, another, slightly newer destroyer. He continued a low-level defiance of authority when, having been refused permission to transfer a whaler, which was a type of ship's boat, which was an especially swift example of the kind and much favoured in regattas held between various ships, to the Orwell, he just swapped them over overnight anyway, and then when Locust returned home and a letter was sent out asking quite why the older destroyer had a brand new whaler aboard, as Orwell had just come out of dock, he simply burned the letter, and apparently everybody else forgot about it. It was aboard Orwell that his lieutenant's certificate eventually arrived, and shortly thereafter he was recalled home for reassignment, this time to the cruiser Northampton, which he boarded in June 1904. The old ship was only used as a training vessel for a little while longer, with the crew moving over to the cruiser Hawke in November, Cunningham at this point being the officer in charge of the boys being trained, and thus his training was no longer in basic seamanship, but in the basics of large-scale command. A training squadron, made up of Hawke, St. George, Edgar, Isis and Highflyer, was then sent over to the West Indies, a voyage in which Cunningham found himself having to take over as navigator after the officer in question came down sick. Hawke paid off in May 1906, and then there was a brief period aboard HMS Scylla before being moved again to the Suffolk, now back on active duty and in the Mediterranean once more, which was now under the overall command of Admiral Lord Beresford, although there was currently much dissatisfaction with him due to a fortunately short-lived scheme which he'd implemented, which required ships to run utterly silent, with orders given by hand gestures only, which, surprisingly, had led to some rather understandable odd occurrences when ships were trying to manoeuvre. Gunnery was being advanced in the fleet considerably, though, and although there were a few odd dead ends involved, Cunningham recalled one incident when he was assigned to work a complicated instrument which produced some sort of graph. What exactly it was supposed to do, I cannot remember, but in his report on the instrument, the representative of the Inspector of Target Practice reported, "The extreme ingenuity of this instrument rather blinds one to its absolute uselessness." With 4 years as a lieutenant, the minimum required to be eligible for a command position, in April 1908 he asked his captain for a recommendation for command of a destroyer once Suffolk paid off. This he duly did, and the young officer was then sent to HMS Hecla, a torpedo boat mothership, to take charge of HM Torpedo Boat No. 14. This 270-ton turbine-driven and oil-fired coastal destroyer would thus be his first full command. The ship was part of the reserve fleet, as part of a policy where large numbers of smaller destroyers were manned by nucleus crews, and thus, when, along with HMS Kangaroo and Torpedo Boat No. 13, they were ordered to Campbelltown in Scotland, they had to conduct the voyage in stages, anchoring each night so that the crew could rest. This started a period of intense training in gunnery and torpedo warfare, and in August, Captain Reginald Tyrwhitt, who was soon to gain fame as the commander of the Harwich Force, arrived to take overall command of the destroyers thus present. In summer 1909, the ships were brought up to full crew complement in anticipation of large combined fleet exercises, but the death of his father meant that Cunningham would miss these events, and shortly thereafter he was promoted to command of HMS Vulture. Although somewhat larger at about 350 tons, and faster, with a top speed of 30 knots, her coal-burning nature left Cunningham with the feeling that this command was something of a step down. However, an exchange of destroyers between Portsmouth and Devonport left him rapidly moved to the much superior HMS Roebuck, which, while still a coal burner, was a much better and more efficient sailor than the Vulture. Unfortunately, problems with her machinery would see her being paid off at the end of 1910 to go into a deep overhaul. Faced with reassignment to a larger vessel, as the Admiralty apparently didn't want junior officers to get too used to the idea of being in charge, Cunningham once more asked his immediate superior to put in a word for him. This worked once again, and in January 1911 he was assigned HMS Scorpion, a brand new destroyer so fresh out of the docks that she still smelled of new paint. Triple the displacement of his previous commands, her only vice was a combination of turbine engines with coal-fired boilers. Under the overall command of Commodore Sir Robert Arbuthnot, who would later die leading the 1st Cruiser Squadron at Jutland, but was currently stationed aboard the cruiser Boadicea, he faced an unusual regime of extremely strict discipline and uniform standards, which most of the flotilla hated, but also one of relative uniformity and magnanimity. Arbuthnot held himself to the same standards that he expected of everybody else, and ran massive interference for his men against what he saw as silly impositions from the Admiralty. One example being a retroactive order that all in command of destroyers must have passed some very specific exams in navigation, gunnery, torpedoes and signals that the Admiralty had just made up. That he hadn't managed to run his ship aground or blow up anything that was the wrong target in 3 years of command rather indicated that Cunningham did have the skills in question, but those who commanded desks didn't particularly care. Arbuthnot, however, saw to it that his affected officers took the navigation test, which of course they passed, and then creatively forgot to do anything about the other 3 exams until whichever paper pusher came up with the idea had either lost interest, had been transferred, or possibly had been atomized by a wandering Admiral Fisher. It was aboard Scorpion that Cunningham witnessed the 1911 Coronation Naval Review at Spithead, where he noted the presence of 26 miles of British warships, consisting of no less than 42 battleships ranging from ironclads to dreadnoughts, 4 battle cruisers, 30 armoured cruisers, 37 protected cruisers, 8 scout cruisers, 15 torpedo gunboats, and 68 destroyers, which included himself, 12 torpedo boats, 8 submarines, and 7 depot ships. He finished this extensive tabulation with a note that there were also many foreign men of war. Training was stepped up once again. 3 weeks of training at sea off Harwich, followed by weeks of harbour drills was the schedule, and the weather had no allowance made for it. Tensions with Germany were rising, and exercises with the home fleet were followed by a scare when 3 German flotillas on exercise in the North Sea managed to slip away from a ship that was keeping an eye on them. Cunningham and his force were ordered to patrol the entrance of Moray Firth against a potential Port Arthur-style attack. The official line was not to provoke anything if the Germans appeared, but wait for them to make the first move. Privately, they were ordered to blast anything that moved without lights first and ask questions later. Luckily, nothing showed up. During a nighttime navigation up the channel, the Scorpion was rammed by a sailing merchant ship that was travelling without any lights in bad weather. The merchant vessel promptly sank, although mildly damaging the destroyer. The Scorpion was nonetheless able to save all but one of the merchant ship's crew. It would then take a few months to repair Scorpion. The fleet was then reorganised in July 1912. Arbuthnot moved off to command cruiser squadrons, and Cunningham's ship was moved to the 3rd Flotilla and joined the home fleet full-time. Hard training continued, now in company of full fleet formations, and in September 1913 the most experienced flotilla, 3rd, was dispatched to the Mediterranean, ostensibly for a year of further training and development before they would be brought home and the commanders and crews reassigned to the latest vessels that were then under construction. But of course, therefore, the flotilla was still out there when war broke out in 1914, and this is where a good number of them would remain. The outbreak of World War I found the Mediterranean fleet much reduced from what it had been a decade earlier. There were 3 battle cruisers under Admiral Milne, 4 armoured cruisers under Rear Admiral Trowbridge, 4 town-class cruisers, and the 16 destroyers of 3rd Flotilla. On July 28th, most of the fleet had left Alexandria heading for Malta, arriving on the 30th. Upon replenishment, they were ordered to sea on August the 2nd, with the formal declaration of war arriving on the 5th. Cunningham's half of the flotilla was ordered to the Adriatic to look out for the possible emergence of the Austro-Hungarian fleet and to guard against Goeben and Breslau coming up to join the Austro-Hungarian forces. In company with Trowbridge's cruisers, they would then set off in the small hours of the 7th when it became clear that the German ships were in fact heading east, with the expectation of action at dawn. But, as we know, this was not to be, Trowbridge calling off the pursuit, albeit by this stage, thanks to a collier having gone to the wrong port, only 3 out of the 8 destroyers were still with the cruisers with any amount of fuel aboard. Scorpion, of course, was one of those that was still in formation. Instead, he was sent, along with the cruiser defence, to help the Marine Nationale in an operation that aimed to trap the Austro-Hungarian fleet. Unfortunately, after what he described as the inspiring sight of horizon-to-horizon tricolours, the grand plan only managed to entrap the small cruiser Zentner, which was sunk. The other half of the flotilla had been recalled back to home waters in the interim, but Scorpion and the 7 of the other half of 3rd Flotilla remained. These were then assigned to blockade the Dardanelles, during which time they found and sank a small yacht that the Ottomans were turning into a mine layer, followed by witnessing the November 3rd, 1914 bombardment of the forts, which of course provided the defenders with everything they needed in terms of information on what those forts' weaknesses were. Some months later, Scorpion was also there to witness the opening bombardment of the main Gallipoli campaign. Initially this went poorly, but the arrival of the brand new HMS Queen Elizabeth gave the attack a punch that resulted in relatively good progress being made, with the destroyers mostly trying to be helpful and covering the minesweepers. But the problem Cunningham identified was not just that the trawlers being used for the purpose had essentially civilian crews, but also they were far too slow. In the racing currents of the Dardanelles, they could barely make any headway and thus made excellent targets, which compounded their crew's consternation. If some of the destroyers had been given sweeps instead, they might have accomplished considerably more, but although Scorpion and her flotilla mates were ordered to be so fitted in early March, for some reason they were all left behind in the large-scale offensive of the 18th, which would see the loss of Irresistible, Ocean and Bouvet. Instead, in the aftermath of that particular debacle, Scorpion was sent to try and destroy the submarine E-15, which had run ashore and was now suspected to be in Ottoman hands. Their first attempt failed to find the sub, although they did find a dud torpedo floating down the current from a submarine that had tried to destroy E-15 earlier. The second try, in support of a pair of small boats, each armed with a single torpedo in a cradle, appeared to be more successful. Albeit on yet another night voyage, not related to the destruction of E-15, they did actually find the submarine's wreck. There was no particular word on whether or not the torpedo had hit, but it was very definitely wrecked by that stage. The campaign then passed into the troop landing phase, during which Cunningham raged that for the first few critical days, the destroyers, for some reason, were forbidden from firing in support of the troops. After that order was rescinded, Ottoman gun batteries also seemed to suddenly become more accurate, with Scorpion being hit once in the mess deck. Other destroyers in the flotilla were somewhat more heavily hit, and Cunningham was also witness to the loss of the battleships Triumph and Majestic, as well as assisting in recovering survivors from the water. Without sonar or depth charges, neither of which had been invented at this stage, there was precious little the destroyers could have done to protect the battleships from a submarine unless that submarine was willing to surface, albeit the idea of popping a bag over an immerged periscope before smashing it with a hammer was circulated to the fleet as a suggestion, much to the general amusement of Scorpion's crew. Instead, the ship spent some time in shore bombardment operations, to the general approval of the army, with the ship occasionally taking further hits, but nothing too serious. During this time, Scorpion in particular was noted for hot and accurate fire multiple times, both supporting troop advances and defending against Ottoman counterattacks. As something of a reward, on July 1st, 1915, Cunningham received a promotion to commander well ahead of his place in the seniority queue. But despite their best efforts and the arrival of monitors, advancing much beyond the range of direct naval gunfire was proving to be largely impossible, and the hills and ridges of the Dardanelles left that range quite reduced. By December, the ship was instead involved in evacuation operations. With that campaign over, Scorpion was instead assigned to a variety of patrol duties that gradually shifted towards convoy escort by the end of 1916, albeit there was some excitement along the way, attacking various small villages where Ottoman patrols were discovered, with the bridge being rigged with metal plates to allow the ship to close in without risk to the crew from rifle fire. In the summer of that year, Scorpion had to go home temporarily for repairs, which placed Cunningham in temporary command of HMS Rattlesnake instead. That lasted for 3 months until Scorpion came back out, albeit with a brand new crew, save for one man. The ship was then promptly rammed astern by her sister ship Wolverine, which meant another month of repairs in Malta. Convoy escort duty, however, went well. No ships were lost on convoys that were escorted by Scorpion, but Cunningham himself was somewhat split as to whether this was good work on his part or just sheer good luck. By the end of 1917, though, he was convinced there was no serious action left to be had in the Mediterranean and requested reassignment to the Harwich Force or the Dover Patrol, and in December the Scorpion was duly ordered home. Along the way, various passengers picked up at Malta included a small terrier that turned out to belong to one Miss Nona Christine Byatt, who would just over a decade later become Miss Nona Christine Cunningham. A rather violent storm accompanied them home, and considerably lightened by the seas having washed away everything above deck apart from the funnels, which included the ship's boats, Scorpion pulled into Plymouth and paid off at the end of January 1918. The next month saw temporary duty in command of HMS Ophelia, as her captain was sick. This would be Cunningham's only time with the Grand Fleet during World War I, and in late March he was given a more permanent command, HMS Termagant of the Dover Patrol. The ship was then under refit, and so was not down in the Channel until late April, which meant that pretty much her first action was escorting the monitors that were taking part in the Zeebrugge raid, although the ship missed the attack on Ostend due to its boilers needing to be cleaned. Whilst part of the Dover Patrol, Termagant was actually mostly based at Dunkirk in order to be close to the action. During this period, whilst escorting HMS Terror out on night patrol, which, yes, for those of you at the back, would make her a night terror, Cunningham spotted 4 German destroyers. Since he had 4 ships of his own, he raced off to attack, only to find another 5 enemy destroyers coming to help their friends, and then 4 more. Outnumbered 13-4, the action went on until ships on both sides began to run out of ammunition, a combination of high seas and poor gunnery all around conspiring to result in huge amounts of ammunition being expended in exchange for exactly 1 hit, scored by Termagant on her opposite number. As it turned out, Terror had been ordering Cunningham to withdraw for most of the engagement, signals that Cunningham had utterly ignored. This was reported by the rather angry captain of the Terror to the Commodore of their section, who decided to ignore the entire incident apart from approving Cunningham's request for more gunnery practice. A few weeks later, summoned by Admiral Keyes, he learned that he had been selected to lead another attack on Ostend. For this, he was given an old battleship, the Swiftsure, and rapidly contrived a plan to take the ship in between the breakwaters, ram the westernmost one, and let the tide swing the ship about. An old cruiser would then ram the battleship's stern, likewise being turned about, and they would then both scuttle themselves, completely blocking the exit. Unfortunately, with only days to go before the operation was launched, the laying of a massive German minefield outside Ostend, along with their ceasing the use of the canal in question, put paid to the idea, and so it was back to Termagant for the last 3 months of the war. This was not a dull end to the war, though. Reports began to filter in that Ostend had been abandoned by the Germans. Admiral Keyes wanted to know if it was true, and thus decided to board Termagant and ordered he be taken to Ostend. This was duly done, and he discovered that this was indeed mostly true. However, the 12-inch batteries at Zeebrugge took exception to the presence of the British destroyer and opened up. At one point during their understandably swift exit, a shell came so close that most of the splash landed on the canvas awning that had been set up to cover the bridge, which promptly collapsed and left a very soaked Cunningham, Keyes and the rest of the bridge crew struggling to extricate themselves from the wreckage. Keyes managed to get free first, stuck his head over the edge of the bridge, and ordered the crew to find him pieces of the shell in question. Returning to Dunkirk, they were told to be ready to sail again that afternoon and to have a Belgian flag ready. Since they had no such flag aboard, the crew scavenged black, yellow and red material from wherever they could and put together a somewhat passable, if rather oversized flag, just in time for Keyes to reappear with no less than the Belgian King and Queen, who were all promptly taken back to Ostend, to much local rejoicing by the citizens. 2 days later, and it was off to inspect Zeebrugge, taking the last stage of the journey on a coastal motorboat due to the minefields. That was to be the last of the major excitement, although it seemed that Termagant had been decided on being the designated driver for the end of the war, spending time shuttling various dignitaries to and from France, including Admiral Wemyss, the First Sea Lord, the future King George VI, the Prime Minister, and Admiral Beatty, of whom Cunningham observed only that we were glad to show him a sample of Dover weather in the shape of a southwesterly gale. As 1919 dawned, he asked for an overseas destroyer command as he sensed that home water destroyers would be rather dull for the foreseeable future. And in March he was given command of the new HMS Seafire. This ship was due to head for the China station, but that was not to be, as it turned out, for 2 reasons. Firstly, the idea of basing a destroyer flotilla there was scrapped, and the flotilla that was currently out there recalled in its entirety. And secondly, with the Russian Revolution in full swing, the ship was reassigned to be part of the Royal Navy's intervention in the Baltic, which we've covered in the video whose link should hopefully be appearing somewhere round about now. This episode of Cunningham's career will be the last that we'll cover in this particular episode, but in any case, he sailed under the overall command of the now Admiral Walter Cowan, formerly the Aide de Camp back in South Africa, who was based in the cruiser Curaçao, along with 4 other destroyers. Arriving in support of the independence of the 3 small Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. Putting in at a small port about 60 miles north of Libau, Cunningham was horrified to find the population starving. The crew rapidly put together an impromptu soup kitchen and expended their ship's entire stock of rations, feeding everyone in the town for several days, sailing off on the 4th day in order to get resupply. The ship arrived back in Libau to find a coup underway by a rather ill-disciplined, largely German army. Communicating this detail to Cowan, Cunningham was ordered to take the Seafire, along with the Scotsman, and rescue any Latvian government members who were still to be found. Wary of possibly having to fight an entire army with 2 destroyers, they nonetheless edged into the narrow inner harbour. There now proceeded a series of rather comedic events. Machine gun parties at the end of the wharf tried to stop them from landing. Cunningham sent them a polite note pointing out that his high-explosive loaded 4-inch guns were considerably larger than theirs, and they dutifully retired. Mooring up next to the customs house, he then saw a number of German troops scattering into nearby streets. Shortly thereafter, a German officer was brought aboard the Scotsman. He had apparently been under orders to seize the building, but when his men fled at the sight of the destroyers, he resolved to shoot himself, for some reason. But he was no more successful with that than he had been at his original mission, and simply ended up carving a channel down the side of his head with the bullet. He was duly patched up and sent ashore. A few of the lesser ministers appeared and informed the British that many others were hiding out in the British embassy before borrowing the ship's typewriter and starting to write propaganda leaflets. A pair of trawlers then tried to arm themselves in support of the German troops, but were told to knock it off or be sunk, and then a young Latvian noble who supported the Germans showed up and asked to search the customs house, presumably looking for government ministers. This Cunningham permitted, as long as he went in company of a British officer, along with a warning that if any fighting started, this would result in point-blank fire from the destroyers. After this night passed without much incident, Cunningham was party to an amusing series of messages from Cowan, who was lying offshore, and whilst the messages were staying just to this side of polite, Cowan was gradually prevailing upon the German general, one von der Goltz, that the Royal Navy was here to dictate what was going to happen next, and this was not a discussion. A line of German sentries tried to keep the locals, who were quite enthused about the British presence, away from them, which was regarded with some humour by the crew as the Minister of Commerce was still in the chart house of Seafire, banging away, wearing out typewriter ribbon, writing all sorts of invective against the said Germans, and then passing it out to whichever Latvians managed to sneak through the sentry line. Frustrated, the Germans spent the next 2 days building a wooden barricade to keep everybody away. The 2 British destroyers dutifully observed and let them complete it, and then, on the night of its completion, simply shifted their moorings slightly further down the quay to the other side of the barricade, which meant the locals could come and visit them freely. In the background, Cowan had eventually prevailed over von der Goltz, and the remaining Latvian government ministers the Germans had arrested were released. This accomplished, the 2 destroyers joined Curaçao for a voyage up to Revel, the main port of Estonia, which has since been renamed. Having previously led HMS Princess Royal at Jutland and 1st Light Cruiser Squadron at the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight, Cowan impressed on his small command that, should whatever elements of the Russian Baltic fleet the Soviets had managed to get to work come out after them, his standing orders primarily consisted of closing in at full speed with all guns blazing. However, a new force of larger and more capable V and W class destroyers had arrived to take over from the S class, and Cunningham's ship was thus sent home, albeit with glowing recommendations from his commanding officer, which read, "Commander Cunningham has on one occasion after another acted with unfailing promptitude and decision, and has proved himself an officer of exceptional valour and unerring resolution." Coming from a man who in the next World War would be found at age 73 in a commando uniform fighting an Italian tank with a pistol, this was high praise indeed, and netted Cunningham a second bar to his Distinguished Service Order, the medal itself and the first bar having been awarded for various actions in the First World War. After a brief stint running mail to and from the Inter-Allied Commission in Germany, Seafire was paid off in November 1919. His memories of her were fond and influenced his comments years later when he was asked to comment on a new class of ship in the Second World War, which would become the Hunt-class frigate. But for the moment, he went on the first leave that he'd experienced since 1914, only to discover that as of the 1st of January 1920, he was Captain Cunningham, about 2 years ahead of where the normal promotion schedule would have otherwise placed him. Thus began his interwar career, but here we'll leave him, at least until next time.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.